Ladies and gentlemen, this is DVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Tonight, we're talking about a story that is as wild as it is worrying. Picture this, a notorious private military company, a shadowy arm of Russian influence known as the Wagner Group, being potentially taken over by the GRU in Libya. Now, this isn't just a shift in management. It's a sign of Russia doubling down on its commitment to creating instability wherever it can, turning global hotspots into their playgrounds. Russia's presence in Africa isn't simply about getting gold or other materials. It's a statement of Russia's growing influence on the continent, a chess move of sorts where gold mines serve as pawns.
Last year, the world held its breath upon news of a coup developing in Russia. On that fateful day, those who by some miracle had not yet heard of Wagner Group learned that Kremlin has a private army for missions that even Russian military officially wouldn't dare conduct. The coup, however, failed. Wagner troops returned to their barracks, and soon after its famous leader died in a plane crash. Since then, not much has been said about the future of the private military company. In the past decade, Moscow has sought to extend its influence in Africa through the deployment of Russian forces, often after the guise of paramilitary fighters, with one aim in mind: access to resources. Russian President Vladimir Putin, however, denies seeking to replace Western influence in Africa, attributing partnerships with African nations to their own preferences. However, analysts suggest Russia has expanded its presence through military deployments and arm deals, rebranding the disbanded Wagner paramilitary group under military intelligence control. This shift aims to offer support to autocratic regimes, securing access to resource while evading Western sanctions. The move signifies a shift towards overt colonialism, with Russia involved in fomenting coups and support military operations in Libya, Sudan, Central African Republic, Niger, Burkina Faso and Mali, countries where thus far France played the role of the main partner. This revelation is bad news for Europe. Analysts warn of potential consequences for the old continent and the West, including increased migration and political destabilization. The most troubling element of this push into Africa, however, is that it gives Russia access to communities with potentially extremist or even terrorist sympathies, which they can exploit for their own purposes.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Let's delve into the Wagner Group, or as I like to call them, a not-so-merry band of mercenaries. Historically, they've been Russia's more plausible than you'd hope deniability card. Those troops annexing Crimea? Yeah, it must have been on vacation. But with the GRU possibly stepping in, they've gone from being a troubling LinkedIn connection to going a direct endorsement from the Kremlin itself. What's the big deal, you ask? Well, the Wagner Group has been Russia's globe-trotting troublemaker, involved in everything from the Donbass to Syria, Central African Republic to Libya. Their involvement usually means one thing: Russia's not just sending get-well-soon cards. But why Libya, you wonder? The country has been in a state of political disarray since 2011. By stepping into this quagmire, the Wagner Group, under the GRU's loving embrace, isn't just offering to help find lost kittens. They're there to support one side of a civil war because nothing says helping like adding more guns to a gunfight. This move isn't just about Libya. It's a message to the West that we can reach you where it hurts. And not just by traditional means, we're talking about hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, and yes, manipulating migrant flows into Europe. Europe's got a tricky path to navigate, balancing the need for security with the risk of escalating tensions, like playing the floor is lava except the floor is actual lava. The Wagner Group's Russia's freelance guns for hire has long eyed Africa's gold as a means to enrich the Kremlin. Their modus operandi? A blend of military might and strategic partnerships, leveraging conflict zones for economic gains. The stakes? Not just the control of gold mines, but influencing the political landscape like in Mali. And as far as their methods, in places like Syria, Libya, and more recently Ukraine, all places where the Wagner Group has left its mark, the price is paid in countless lives. Each bullet fired by a Wagner mercenary is a reminder that in the game of nations, the people on the ground aren't just pieces, they're people. And as much as we'd like to think it's all going to end in a season finale twist where the good guys win, real life, unfortunately, doesn't follow a script. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Jędrzej Cherub, coordinator of the Middle East and African program of the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thanks for having me.
So there's a lot to unpack here, and I would like to start with the Wagner Group under new management of GRU. What are we looking at here? Is this one of those meet the new boss, life still sucks situation, or is there more implications to it?
It's more or less new leadership taking over the overall structure. Because on the ground, in some countries, in African countries such as Central African Republic, Mali, not much changed. You pretty much have the same personnel. You pretty much have the same activities, and you have a fair degree of continuity of policies. In Libya, you had some major, reshuffle that people were taken back and new people sent in. So we have a rebranding, which you don't really have officially. We don't really have Wagner Group anymore, and we have something which is called the African Corps, which is accompanied by a new media structure or propaganda structure, which is called the African Initiative, which, apart from having its headquarters in Russia, is also setting up offices in various African countries to coordinate the messaging that is around the structure. And the only place where you have where you have this new brand really coming with a completely new structure is Burkina Faso. It's a country which didn't have Russian mercenary presence before, and only in recent weeks it started. They arrived. They set up a new base, and that's pretty much the only place where we can actually say that this is an experimental, site where this whole new structure is being, set up. In most of the other places, it was just rebranding. Even the Wagner Group brands actually is still alive in some of those places.
Right. Speaking of rebranding, I feel like it is quite sinister, isn't it? Because the name Wagner Group is already kind of tainted in a way, but now it's called either African Corps, African Initiative. You would be a little bit more removed from their connection with Russia. However, we do have to realize that it is still under Russian control. And can you help us understand what's Russia's purpose there in utilizing these mercenaries?
Well, the previous context of Wagner Group, which benefited from the policies of plausible denial that Russia had, that it could distance itself from those activities. And it's true that those structures were pretty much set up by Mr. Prigozhin and by his associates, and that was run in a far more autonomous way that we could expect if we think about how Russian state functions. So it was his own ideas, his own policies that were implemented in many African countries that were then kind of officialized or absorbed. I mean, they work in favor of Russian goals, but he had certain degree of autonomy and people who run his businesses in those countries were more loyal to him than to authorities in Russia. That system was, couldn't be continued first after Wagner came out of shadows,
right,
and then when Prigozhin set the mutiny and
there's no way he could be kept in there. So with the GRU taking over, do you think that this might change, that it will give Moscow even more control over the region?
I don't think so. Well, Prigozhin and his people gained significant experience on the ground. And now you have completely new people who don't know the area, who don't know local realities, who don't know the people, who don't know, what is seen well by local actors and what is not taking over. There is a big risk that actually they will spoil what Prigozhin built in terms of the self, the machine that worked by itself. And here we have, so there's always this question about what to be allowed to continue so that the entire structure works well, and how to tighten the control so that the structure doesn't come out of control. And they're trying to find this balance. So we have those new people on the top, like Averyanov or like Vice Minister Yevkuryev, who are new faces of the African, of the Russian military footprint in Africa. But the majority of the mercenary community, as you can call it, is pretty much the same, because it's not big. It's the same circle that just shifts between different brands, but they are all friends, and they are all those are pretty much the same people.
Right. So speaking of these mercenaries in Russia, in Africa, I'm also curious about their purpose, because, of course, we do know that Africa is rich in natural resources, and they do want the gold. On the other hand, Russians are also there kind of destabilizing the political situation. And so my question would be, what do they stand to gain from the destabilization of these governments?
Well, I mean, they are certainly, destabilizing efforts of French and efforts of the European countries and efforts of the US and their interests in those regions. They are, heating up criticism of those countries and encouraging governments to break ties with the West. I wouldn't really say that the goal is to create chaos in those countries. We like to, I mean, when we think about Russian activities in Europe or in US, we have this cliche that, okay, if they come here, they come here to sow chaos.
Right.
But over there, it's more profitable for them to actually entrench authoritarian leaders, to turn them into their clients, and to support them in a way that they're more and more, authoritarian, more and more, military governments that are functional, that can get access to natural resources, and that they can control the narrative in those states. Collapse of those countries and chaos is not really in favor of Russia. They would prefer to have friends, governments, leaders who are unchecked by their societies, who are unchecked by the international rules, but who are clients to the Russian state.
Right, so for the Russians, there is a little bit of method to this madness. Like, we see it as chaos, but for them, it might seem like it's benefiting their cause. And do you think that most of these, like you said, is done to kind of drive a rift between the Western nations and Africa?
Yes, it's exploiting the pre-existing sentiments and some real concerns. If you look at the Sahel area, for example, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, which is marred by increasing activity of the jihadist groups. The presence of Western military missions and interventions didn't really help to fix the problem. It's easy to tell or to exploit those sentiments that, well, I mean, those guys didn't really manage to fix the situation, so maybe let's try someone else. I mean, and it's actually a trend in African, countries that they want to have more choice of partners. They want to have a broader selection, broader choice of partnerships. And Russia is one of them. I mean, from their perspective, it's a partner like any other who says that is capable of fixing the situation, of helping them, and they are giving it a try. We can expect that this choice would not be, very productive, because if you look at the jihadi activities in the region, they are just continuing to expand, and it's more and more. The countries are becoming more and more exposed when they expel Western militaries. Still, they need to learn the lesson to know it.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, because they haven't had that experience, especially given they don't have this extensive history with Russia as a lot of us have here. They probably don't have any point of reference to that. And another thing I would like to ask, because we do know that the methodology you just mentioned earlier have been relatively effective in driving a wedge between Africa and the West. I'm also looking at, like you mentioned earlier, the number of mercenaries in Africa is actually not that massive. So I'm curious, what have they been leveraging in order to kind of control these areas?
Well, in Central African Republic is between 1,000 and 2,000 Russian mercenaries. In Mali, similar figures. So it's a few thousand if you look at the whole continent. So it's actually quite a big number if you look at the war that Russia wages in Ukraine. theoretically, all those guys should have been needed in the front lines in Ukraine. Still, Russia can afford sending some of them to African countries to work in favor of their interest. So I mean, last year in November 2023, the Russian Wagner mercenaries were able to help Malian government to come and conquer the northern town of Kidal, which was in hands of Tuareg separatists for many years and which was inaccessible for the Malian government since a decade, since last decade. So it has some real successes on the ground. It's not all, you know, a bubble. They are willing to go to patrol areas which are you know, under threats from jihadists. They are engaging in real fight, and they are ready to have some sacrifice. To see some of those guys being killed. So from the point of view of African governments, they seem to be more prepositioned to actively support local governments than the UN forces, for example. In the DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we're just seeing a process of the UN forces leaving the country because they lost trust of local population and of local government, because the UN themselves were saying that we are helpless. We cannot really confront the rebels who are stronger than us. Russians at least tell that they will try, and that's the difference.
Right. Thank you so much for helping us unpack all of this. It's a lot to take in, and thank you so much for being with us on Eastern Express. Really appreciate it. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the latest stories from the East they don't want to miss. The Institute for the Study of War reports that Russian financial, economic, and military indicators suggest preparations for a large-scale conventional conflict with NATO. According to the American think tank, this could be on a potentially shorter timeline than previously thought.
Ever since the onset of the war in Ukraine, tensions between NATO and Russia have reached levels not seen since the Cold War. Even though Vladimir Putin has assured many times that he's focused only on Ukraine, a new arms race has begun. A classified German intelligence report indicates Russia's military is preparing for a potential conflict with NATO beginning in 2026, with signs of army reorganization, troop movement, and missile deployments in western Russia. President Vladimir Putin's focus on appointing competent individuals to legislative bodies and criticism of the Russian elite highlights efforts to stabilize Russia's long-term financial position amidst increased military spending. Despite international sanctions, Russia appears to be prioritizing long-term financial stability over any immediate issues. Concerns voiced by Polish President Andrzej Duda about Russia's accelerated preparations for a potential attack on NATO country align with the ISW's assessment. Ongoing Russian military reforms, including the formation of the Dnieper River Flotilla, suggests readiness for a potential conflict with NATO rather than the current situation in Ukraine.
Amid complications sparked by a stalled aid package in the U.S. Congress, the Dutch defense minister has said that Ukraine should receive its first F-16 fighter jets this summer. The arrival of these modern fighter jets is crucial for Ukraine's defense capabilities, especially considering Russia's use of advanced aircraft in the ongoing conflict.
Ukraine's existing fleet of Soviet-era jets is outdated and inadequate compared to Russia's, making the acquisition of F-16s essential for Ukraine's defense strategy. The F-16s will enable Ukrainian pilots to strike deeper into Russian-controlled territories with precision, intercept missiles, and engage Russian jets threatening Ukrainian shipping lanes. According to Dutch Defense Minister Kaja Ollengren, the F-16s will be roaring through Ukrainian skies as soon as this summer to do just that. The F-16 coalition, spearheaded by Netherlands, has vowed to deliver more than 40 such aircraft, a major boost for Ukrainian defenses. While the United States aid package for Ukraine faces delays due to domestic political issues, the European Union has taken steps to increase its assistance. The creation of the Ukraine Assistance Fund with earmarks for military equipment and training reflects Europe's commitment to supporting Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression.
The European Union has begun serious talks regarding allocation of frozen Russian assets to fund military assistance for Ukraine. While a majority of countries seem to be on board with the idea, which could boost military spending for Kyiv by 3 billion euros a year, Austria opposed the move.
Chancellor of Austria Karl Nehammer opposes the European Commission's proposal to allocate profits from frozen Russian assets in the EU for military aid to Ukraine, expressing support for using the funds for reconstruction instead. However, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo endorsed the idea of using these revenues for military assistance, emphasizing the importance of providing Ukraine with the weapons and ammunition it needs for self-defense. The European Commission's plan aims to direct 90% of the profits from immobilized Russian assets to the European Peace Facility for purchasing weapons, with the remaining funds allocated for recovery and reconstruction efforts in Ukraine. While the proposal awaits agreement from EU member states, officials aim for initial payments to Ukraine as early as July.
And now let's move further east to Central Asia. The World Bank projects that Kazakhstan will maintain stable growth over the next 2 years, driven by an active manufacturing industry and increased consumer spending, although a new reform approach is deemed necessary to enhance prosperity.
The World Bank has published a report outlining Kazakhstan's economic prospects amid adjustments to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Growth is expected to moderate 3.4% in 2024 due to lower than expected oil production. Real GDP is forecasted to rebound in 2025, reaching 4.5%. Despite challenges, Kazakhstan's banking system remains resilient, with low non-performing loan ratios and ample liquidity. However, average GDP per capita growth has lagged behind similar countries, necessitating a reassessment of reform priorities to improve living standards and income levels. Looking ahead, downside risks include disruptions in oil exports due to regional instability from the Ukraine conflict, potential oil production setbacks, inflationary pressures, and risk associated with economic ties to Russia, including the threat of secondary sanctions.
And that concludes this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.